Question for Adam Kokesh, Stefan Molyneux, or any libertarian who happens to see this video. Do you or do you not believe that society should be structured around the principle of survival of the economically fittest?
No, I do not believe that society should be organized or subject to the principle of survival of the economically fittest. What I do believe is that no man, that no person, no individual should ever be subject to comply by the force of law to perform any action that is not in violation of the rights of another human being. If my actions do not affect you, you have no right to use the government to police my actions. As a result of that, further, I believe that the only role of the government is to police those actions, to protect individual rights from molestation. Your life, the liberty, the pursuit of happiness, whatever you do with your body is your business. And as well, I believe that economic freedom and social freedom are the same, whereas you would disagree. You would say that some people should sacrifice economic freedom to promote social freedom for the public at large. However, if you sacrifice economic freedom, you'll also sacrifice social freedom. And if you try to refuse that this is actually a social issue, that economic freedom is not a social issue, then I would say, go get somebody to work for you and take all their money and only give them food and a place to sleep. It's called slavery. So, the suspension of economic freedom for the sake of another is slavery, my friend. So anyways, I do not support survival of the economically fittest. I do support the idea that other people should not be able to use the government to force their beliefs on other people. And if you do not believe that that is force, that the use of law or the use of government is force, then what happens if you disobey law? What happens if you disobey government? You get put in jail. Or in some cases, they may kill you. So, the government is force. The use of law is force. And that's one thing that must be understood. Let's move on to the next question.
What are you going to do with all the people who are currently depending upon government assistance to survive? Are you okay with the idea of abruptly cutting them off and letting them fend for themselves?
You're right. There are many people that have become dependent on the government and the government assistance. So no, I am not in favor of abruptly cutting them off. I believe that's silly. Now what I do believe in is that we could afford a transition period to where we could transition away from the policies that we've developed over the last 80 years since the 1930s, which are so vehemently, not vehemently, but so strongly advocate. What needs to happen is that we need to stop these unconstitutional wars and borrowing money from China to go drop bombs on the Middle East. It's costing you and me a lot of money. We need to completely cut that off. We need to cut off foreign aid. We actually give more money in foreign aid to the enemies of Israel than we actually give to Israel herself. So the idea of foreign aid, especially the way it's set up now, is silly. In the wars, in the foreign aid, put it towards propping up the current systems, which aren't solvent. Currently, we are bankrupt, and we really can't afford these entitlement programs. The only way to keep them going is to end the wars, end the foreign aid, prop them up through a transition period, using the money that we saved, slowly transition off of them. But no, there should not be an abrupt halt to these entitlement programs. I think that would just be asking for problems. There would be a very, very large domestic problem. But if we continue to spend money the way we are at this rate, and we completely go bankrupt, there's going to be no other choice. Austerity is going to be the only measure that's going to be financially a path to get us back on the right track. So we have to think about this soon and take care of it now, because these things that you like, we can't afford them right now, and especially with the wars that we have going on. So think about that, and definitely know you can't stop it very abruptly. Let's move on to the next point.
A lot of the people who are on welfare right now don't want to be on welfare, but without it, they might not have enough food to put on their family's table each month.
You've made a very good point here that must be addressed. And really, we must address the fundamental question. As you have said, a lot of the people that are on welfare don't want to be on welfare, but they can't see economically a way to do otherwise. So let's address the fundamental question. Why are so many people dependent on the government in the first place? So what happens whenever you get on welfare or you get on unemployment and you start considering going back into the workforce? So let me give you an example, because I've known several people that have lost jobs over the last few years, as many of us have known, and so I've had people that, for instance, have been getting, for instance, maybe $300 a week for unemployment after losing a job. Meanwhile, they go look for a job and they can only get paid, say, $400 a week for doing that job. So they're actually only working for an extra $100 a week. So this is what I would call the differential wage. So the people are actually, by going to work, they're sacrificing 40 hours of their time, but they're only gaining $100 for that time. Meanwhile, they could spend their entire work doing leisure activities, 0 hours of work, and get $300. So as you see, there's a large incentive for people not to go to work. And the wage level cutoffs actually discourage people that re-enter the workforce. Because people know that, oh, if I go back to work, they're going to cut my benefits off, so I better not go look for a job. A lot of people don't want to give up their current financial security. And if they are, for instance, if they've been receiving unemployment, if they've been receiving welfare, it's their financial security. It's what they know. It's allowed them to functioned financially in the past, and they're not willing to give that up. No one is. How many people are you willing? How many people do you know that are willing just to immediately quit their job? Their excuse for not quitting their job was because, oh, I can't give up the paycheck. I need the money to do this, this, and this, and this. And the same reason is given by people on welfare and by people on other entitlement systems, unemployment and the like. You actually get placed in a position where you can survive without having to work, and the consequences for going to work, having to sacrifice that 40 hours a week, are more harsh than staying at home and receiving the check. So there's your answer to that. And like I said, it's a great point that you made, that most of these people on welfare really don't want to be on welfare. But they have no choice because the way the system is set up, it forces them into that position. So, and there's no way to fix that problem. It's a natural consequence of having the system in the first place. So let's move on to the next point.
I hope you realize that there are hardworking, very often college-educated families who are receiving food stamps right now, more than ever before.
I absolutely do understand your point here, and I would like to, talk about it in context, from my experience. I've taught at a university for the last 4 years, and in the general chemistry course, which is the number of students in that course is, in direct proportion to the enrollment at the university. It's one of the, more broadly required courses among the, among the majors. So, as I started, there were 1,200 students, if I recall correctly, in the general chemistry course. And then, just this last year, there were 1,600. So that's an increase of 400. So let me get my calculator. So 400. So that's an increase of 33%. Anyway, so you have a 30% increase in the number of students, and this is not a surprising number to me, because I realize the direct impact of government involvement. So the government has been, very heavily subsidizing college education these days, much in the same way that public education was instated, K through 12. The federal government, through a backdoor way, has now made a college education, university education, public education as well, to some degree. So this is produced with the availability of loans and the easy money to get funded to go to school. This has increased the demand for school. So the price of school has been going to a university, getting a college education, has been bid up. But this is really of no concern to the student, because they're really, at that time, they're not really thinking about having to pay for that. All those loans or anything like that is deferred. So being human, only thinking about the short term, it seems like free money, regardless whether it's deferred or whatever. So what happens is the classes swell, the numbers of the class swell. For instance, the general chemistry class in 4 years swelled by approximately 400 people. So which, like I said, was a 30% increase over 4 years. So if you consider that, what really happens, the effect on the class, the effect on the overall grades, is you have an increased failure rate. Whenever you have an increased failure rate in a class, there's an internal demand in the department to make, or even an internal demand within the mind of the instructor sometimes, or within the mind of the professor, to actually make the material easier, to increase the passing percentage. So what happens is the people at the top of the class that normally would have actually learned more being in prior classes because more was covered, because their material has been restricted due to passing rates. Those top students, those students that could have learned more, are held back, do not learn as much. So you have the working pool, the pool of people that come out of universities are diluted as far as knowledge. Even the people that are very intelligent have not completely learned everything that would have been learned at an earlier stage, because the quality of the education has been decreased for the sake of maintaining a certain passing rate and minimizing the failure rate. So what happens, you have a more unqualified pool of people coming out of universities. So now a company, it's much more difficult, since it's so much easier to make a good grade in the courses. It's much more difficult for companies to discriminate in a positive way of who are the most qualified people to be problem solvers within their field, who can address the problems within the field that they're hiring for. So they have a lot of people now that have made the grades, so to speak, in the universities, but the quality of education has decreased. So even the most qualified, even the best candidates, if they do hire them, still need some training. But many times they may hire someone that is really probably would have been on an average, the threshold of average, with prior standards that held students to knowing a certain amount of certain degree, of information, to have learned so much, from high school and things like that. So the act of employing someone, which is a financial investment, has become much more risky. So it makes people more hesitant to hire people. And the people that they do hire, they have to scrutinize more, so it increases the cost of hiring someone, even in the money that you have to spend up front, because you have to scrutinize them more. You have to be more diligent in your methods of hiring, because it's a more risky investment nowadays. So the government has really hurt us, in that sense, in subsidizing education, and it's really flooded places where there is demand for work. It floods those places, and whenever it floods those places, it dilutes the workforce in the way that I've mentioned, and makes hiring a more risky proposition, and therefore the turnover rate is higher, and more people are in need of assistance. Now, if the standards in education were maintained, and I think if we're an evolving species, then the standards of education should increase over time. It should become more difficult instead of less difficult. So, if we maintain that idea, maintain the difficulty, the quality, maintain the quality of the education, in defiance of the failure rate, then we will create an instance to where people that do have a college education will be, a higher percentage of those people will be, will be employed. But as long as we're on the current path right now, we are definitely going to have people that have a college education that find themselves in a position where they're unqualified to perform any goals that are or any jobs that are beneficial to the workforce, because the quality of the education has been decreased. And this is a direct result of government interference in education. So let's move on to your next point.
You say statists believe in violence, that statists believe in pointing guns at rich people and forcing them to pay their taxes. Let's try to square that abstract idea with reality. How many times has Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, or Bill Gates ever seen a government gun pointed at them?
I will point out that I do not endorse any of the three people that you spoke of. But you ask, when is the last time that force has been used against them to get them to comply with the government? And I would ask you this question. What was the penalty, what would have been the penalty if they refused to pay taxes? If they refused to comply with the government? If they refused to participate? Would the government had come after them with claims of tax evasion? I'm sure they would have, given the amount of money those people make. At that time, the government would have authority to place penalties on those people, to do things against them that they would not have liked because they refused to pay their taxes. But however, what if the government is performing actions that these people do not agree with? What if these people had said that I do not agree with the wars and I will not pay that part of my taxes which goes to fund the wars? So, these people have been under the force of law to pay their taxes. That is the gun to which was referred, the force to which was referred, is that if you do not comply with the government, force will be used against you to compel you to comply, or you will be subject to incarceration or some other penalty equivalent to that. So, let's move on.
The rich man never sees the gun. But that doesn't matter to you. The fact that he potentially could see the gun is somehow far more upsetting to you than stuff that is actually happening to people who don't happen to be rich. Because you know who does see the gun? not in some theoretical, abstract way, but in reality? Poor and middle class people, when they've been foreclosed on, and the sheriff with an actual gun on his belt shows up to kick them out of their house. Hard-working middle-class families, some of them veterans who have fought for their country like you, Adam Kokesh, are losing their homes in this catastrophic, traumatizing tidal wave of foreclosures that continues sweeping across the nation.
It's very ironic that you would bring up this particular point. Actually, what happened, and the reason why so many people are getting foreclosed on at this time, was because interest rates were held very low, and at the same time, Congress passed legislation to loosen and make it more appealing and easier to make very high-risk loans on these residential houses, and this began in the early 2000s. So with the low interest rates, it was people could get money for practically nothing to buy these houses. So because of that, the price of houses got really bid up because the demand for houses became very high because the money was so easy to get. The money was cheap. So the price of houses got bid up, and now the people are getting loans for these houses that were actually worth much less than what they were getting the loans for. So in 2008, this bubble burst, and it couldn't be sustained. That was for certain. And the price of these houses started becoming way less than what the people had the houses financed for. The people became upside down, in their commitments for these houses. And naturally, they had to default on these houses. The government provided the legislation and the conditions for these things to happen. Meanwhile, these people had been renting, or they had been living in a cheaper house where they had cheaper payments, and then the cheap money that came along, made possible by the government, caused them to move out of the houses that they had been living in for years. They moved out of the houses in the neighborhoods that they've been living in for years and moved into these more expensive houses, only to find that a few years later, the environment and the bullshit that the government put forth to create these conditions was just that. It was bullshit. And that now, the economic conditions, as a result of those things that the government did, caused that bubble created by them to crash, and now the people were upside down and they could no longer afford to live in these houses. And that's why the people got screwed out of their houses. I mean, if you want to say, the houses they got screwed out of aren't the houses you're thinking of. The houses they got screwed out of were the houses they were living in, the cheaper houses they were living in before the government got involved. Those people got displaced by the cheap credit. So you need to look at a different place to place that blame, because that was government intervention, government philanthropy that caused that mess. So let's move on.
So yeah, I'd like you to answer my question. Do you or do you not believe society should be structured around the principle of survival of the economically fittest?
No. Have a good night.